Hi everyone, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here with another PB&J card class, and I hope you can grab a good cup of coffee or whatever you enjoy, because this is kind of a long video, but I wanted to share with you one technique that I use for mass producing cards. And one of my favorite ways to do this is using our creative die cuts from Penny Black and sort of working in an assembly line fashion. So I'm going to take you through the steps that I do when I'm mass producing a lot of cards, but I want to be able to not produce the same card over and over, but rather produce lots of different cards. So I'm just showing you here, I have my watercolors, which are Distress Ink Reinkers used as watercolors in a palette. I have a cup of water, a paper towel, and some Canson 140-pound watercolor paper. Now, all of the exact supplies that I'm using that I'm showing you here, as well as the Penny Black supplies, will be listed for you down in the YouTube description box below, so you can check them out down there. Now, I have really sped up this video, otherwise you and I would be here like all day as I made these cards. But what I'm going to do first is just have fun making my own papers. So I love the look of watercolor, and I wanted these cards to still have that very watercolor handmade look, but I didn't want to start each card and make it from start to finish, but rather create all the watercolor papers first and cut my die cuts from those. So here I just swiped on my Distress Ink Reinker used as a watercolor. Then I just watered down some white acrylic paint and splattered that on to there. And I love it, kind of creates like a marbled look. I saw that. It is not my own idea. I saw it on another YouTube video. I cannot remember. If I think of it though, I'll put a link down in the YouTube description box below. But yeah, it's really fun to splatter that white acrylic paint onto the wet watercolored paper. Also really great for Christmas, because then you get I don't know, kind of a snowy look to the project. But I am just using different colors. I do have a limited palette, so I kind of put out my favorite set of colors for Christmas using the Distress Ink Reinkers, and am using those throughout all of the cards today. So I've got some blues, I've got some turquoise greens in there. I'll do some more just like regular, more olive toned greens, some grays, and then also some neutrals. Some I will splatter, some I won't. Some I will do in different shades. So there was a light gray, and here I'm going darker. When I use the Distress Ink Reinkers as watercolors, if I want it to be a lighter color, I add more water. If I want it to be a darker color, then I add less water and just scoop up the Distress Ink Reinker without barely even diluting it. I'm using the silver black velvet paintbrushes. Those are also the sizes I'm using listed down in that YouTube description box below. But this is so fun. This is a really great way to watercolor if you don't like fiddly watercolor. And so you can just swipe it on here. There's no wrong way to do it. If it's blotchy, if it's streaky, it's totally okay, because you can place your die cuts over and around any areas that you don't like. Sometimes I splattered just with water, like I'm doing here. So I dried the panel, then splattered it with water. And with the Distress Ink Reinkers, this will kind of give you a mottled effect. You can see there, if I grab up that water with a paper towel, what a different look that gives. Here, of course, I want to have some Christmas red colors to pick from too. So kind of think of what colors you like for your Christmas cards and just make your papers. I die cut my papers so that they are not die cut, but trim down my watercolor paper so that it was the same size as the plates in my die cutting machine. That also saved time. So when I was ready to die cut pieces, I could just lay them on top of the paper and run it through. So here I'm just continuing that process. I hope you don't think it's too boring. I think it's so fun to do, and it's kind of fascinating to watch. So again here, this is where I splattered with water and then lifted it up with the paper towel. And this is why I like using the Distress Ink Reinkers as watercolors, because you really can do those distress ink techniques with them, but they're easy to put onto the papers. Now, you could also skip all of this watercolor steps and just start with colored cardstock and your die cuts. But I kept this in here because I do like how this gives everything a really pretty look. Now, I love Memento Toffee Crunch for a neutral light background. So this is one place where I didn't use the Distress ink reinkers used as watercolors because I just really love this color. I find it gives that sort of vintage look without looking yellowy. So I just pressed that ink pad onto my acrylic block and then swiped it up or picked it up as a watercolor. I also have some grayish or very dark grayish black cardstock from my stash that I wanted to have just to add to some of those neutral looks, and I'm splattering that with the white acrylic paint watered down with water. And so here are all of the different papers that I made. You can see there's nothing perfect about these. They have dried in all different ways. It's just having fun, but you'll see once you start die cutting them, stamping on top, or inking them, it's a really great place to start for a homemade look to all of the elements of your card. I also think the variations that you get with these papers add to just a really nice look to your card making. It doesn't look quite as flat as die cutting from cardstock, but I do that too. It's just a different look and what you prefer. Here down into some of these neutral colors, a lot of variety in those. These are lighter, some splattered, and then the black, and then the black with the splatters. So I took these papers and I wanted to create some sort of like base elements for my cards. So I'm going to grab some dies that I really love to do this with. The first is the 51-397 antique frames. So these are all penny black dies, some of my favorites. Also 51-714 zigzag stackers. And 51-706 semicircle stacker. And now I picked a few of those, mostly the neutrals, and ran those through with those die cutting, those die cuts, or I just trimmed them down into standard size cards with some of those neutrals, some A2 size cards, 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, or to 5 by 7 cards. So those are kind of my neutral backgrounds. And now this is kind of part of this kit that I'm creating. I have all of these sort of neutral backgrounds to layer on my die cut elements. So for my primary die cut elements, now I gathered up, these are new dies from Penny Black. There's 51-742 Immense Joy, 51-741 Holidays. I love the large size of this die. 51-743 Jumbo Bauble. 51-747 Stocking Stuffers. And finally, 51-748 Joy of Giving. And I sat at my die cutting machine and I just die cut all of these from different colors, lots of different options, and I just store my dies in just a regular envelope, and whatever I die cut, I put into the envelope. You wouldn't have to do this. You could also put them on a tray. But I just had fun kind of die cutting these and seeing what different pieces I had, and I just stored them there in the envelope with the dies out on my desk. And one thing I really love about creating in this way is, for me, it kind of takes away the pressure of like, I got to design this card and I want it to be just right, and approaching that over and over and over. I could just sit and paint those papers with no plan in mind for them yet. Then I could just die cut these from all different colors with no plan yet in mind for the cards. It's a great thing to do if you're like me and I have a hard time just sitting and watching TV. I like to have something to do. Just bring your papers out and your die cuts inside your little envelopes and cut them and pop them back into the envelopes, and you can just work on these like section by section, bit by bit, and it doesn't get boring. You're not creating the same card over and over, but the process is the same over and over. So here again, these are the pieces that I die cut. I may not use all of these pieces, and that's okay too. I just store them in the envelope with the die, and they're ready if I'm creating a card at another time. They're just right there. I know where to find them. This is the stocking stuffers one, so you can see I've got the stockings cut out. Lots and lots of these little pieces that are already have the color, already have that variation from all that watercoloring. I mean, I just went crazy. I kept cranking them through the die cutting machine. But I find these little pieces are so handy and helpful to have to just pop into any type of card. So now let's start making the card. So I've got one of those base pieces that I cut using the semicircle stackers, and I am going to mask off some of that stitching. I do sort of pat my tape either on the table or on my shirt to take off some of the stickiness. And then I'm going to do some ink blending here using an ink blending tool and a foam pad, starting off of the edge and working my way on. And by masking off that stitching, it creates a really lovely look of a layered or matted paper, but without having to do any matting and no bulk. I just think it also really draws attention to that beautiful stitching. If you've watched any of my videos lately, I've been doing this a lot, so you can see it's like my new little addiction of card making. Just darkening up the very corners there. And then I will peel that back. It's my favorite part. And you can see it's got that watercolor neutral background, but now that inking. So I'm going to make a card here with this Joy die. So I've cut it a couple of times, some from white cardstock, some from the black, and I'm going to layer that up just for some extra dimension. For me, that's easier than adding like foam squares or foam tape behind those letters, and I like the dimension that it adds. If you do photo cards, this would be a great card design. You could pop a photo into that O section of Joy and make a real personalized photo card. But I'm going to just glue this right onto my card. And now you know all these pieces that I'm going to be pulling in to make all of these cards, they're already made. So now it's just a matter of like grabbing different pieces and playing around with placement. And for me, that's easier. I'm not getting out the paints again. I'm not getting out the die cutting machine again. Now my job is just to play around with placement and designing them. I'm going to pop up these leaves. I love the size of this die. And I'm going to put some foam tape behind the leaves. And you can see back when I put the glue onto that word Joy, I did not put it along every section of each letter. That gave me room to sort of slide in that stem through the back there. Now I love about this Holly Days die is that the berries cut separately, so you can cut them from your red cardstock, or like for me, that paper that I painted red. And it's easy to put together. And then I'm also going to add some pearls on here. Little self-adhesive pearls. And then I will stamp my sentiment onto a little piece of paper. Now the sentiment I'm using here is 30-925 Jolly Snippets. I'll be using this on lots of cards. I love all the small little sizes and the variety of choices for sentiments. I picked out one here that referenced joy, of course, and layered that right on top of the card. Now here again, I'm going to make another card with this Immense Joy die cut. And then I'm also going to pull in all those little sprigs and fir tree leaves and things that I have already die cut. I'm putting together that joy, and then I want to do them going around the O part of this die cut, like a wreath going around. So I'm just playing around with the placement, making sure it's sort of a balanced look to the design, and then I'll just add a few dots of glue, connect them there, and then I can start placing these down and sort of curling them around. And I love there where you can see on those die cut pieces that sort of variation in color and splatters that were a part of that watercolor paper when we created that. I think that just adds so much to those little pieces. And instead of painting them after they're die cut, it was just so much easier to paint the papers first and run a lot through at one time. So I'm going to glue that around. and add a little extra over here on the side. And that also is going onto one of those sort of neutral backgrounds that was already cut with the zigzag stackers die. And my sentiment for this comes from 30-917, Joy and Warmth. So some larger sentiments here that go great with this large Joy die. I love having that right in the center of the O. I also added a few self-adhesive pearls around the outside too, just for some extra dimension and a little elegance to this pretty clean and simple card. So here I have that Antique Frames die, and I'm going to ink up the edges just a little bit more, starting off the edge and working my way on with a circular motion. I'm actually focusing most of the darker color up near the top, and I'm going to ink this background as well. This is the standard size, 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. So I have my background ready. Now I'm going to start assembling these stockings. And in this card I decided to go for sort of like a neutral farmhouse look. So kind of adding in some of those blacks and greens. And I love with this stocking set that it has the branches and things with it. That it's not just the traditional looking stocking set. You certainly could use it that way. You could cut it from red and add gold elements or reds and greens, but I just decided to go a little bit more natural and sort of farmhousey for the design. It also comes with that branch that you can hook the stockings onto. So playing around here with the placement for this. And then these adorable little buttons are also part of the die set. So I'm going to add those on here. And I just keep those stuck to, after I die cut them, stuck to a piece of painter's tape, and I just tape it on the inside of the envelope where I keep my dies. Now next is 40-113 Inspiring. I wanted to add a little stamping to this background in keeping with that natural theme. So I'm inking up my stamp there with some brown ink and stamping that along the top of the background. I'll do some inking on that just so it's not quite as stark on the white background. Pull it down a little bit further around the edges. And then you can see where I can layer on that piece that I was working on. I also decided to sort of cover up the seam here with just a little strip of paper. And then I will add that panel to the front using some foam squares, popping it up a little bit, and I also stamped my sentiment on there. So here is a look at that complete card. And now we will move on to another card with the stocking stuffers. Here I have the semicircle stacker die piece, and I have masked off the edges. And I didn't mask that other side because I knew I wasn't going to be inking over there, because I wanted the darker color to be primarily coming from this one side. Then I'm going to put this into my stamp positioning tool, and I'm going to just lightly tone on tone stamp some branches from our new set 30-918 Nature's Garlands. So I will just ink that up with the same color of ink I was inking the background with. And oh, I just love how delicate that branch is. Just sometimes it's little touches like that that really finish off a card. I'm going to flip it and stamp it down here at the bottom too. because I'm stamping on watercolor paper, I do like to use that stamp positioning tool so I can make sure I get a nice even impression. Watercolor paper does have some texture to it, so I find that pretty helpful. And here I will remove that tape and reveal that layered look that is actually just one layer. And then I went ahead and pre-assembled this using some pieces that I had from that same set, and I stamped my sentiment, and this card is complete. I hope you're still with me. We have a few more cards to make. Here I am going to use these packages that I had already die cut, and I just went ahead and assembled those. And then I'm grabbing that same branch. This time I'm going to stamp it in a very light gray on the background. Again, just that nice finishing touch sort of peeking out from each side of those packages. I'm going to make sure that it actually shows up here. And I will stamp that down. This is going onto that semicircle stacker die, so we get that finished sort of stitched edge look. And then I stamped my sentiment along the top and adhered those packages using some foam squares. And again, those were so easy to assemble and sort of tuck all those little pieces in there because they were already colored and die cut. Just took them out of the envelope and put it together. So now I'm going to work on another background. As you can see, I've done that masking technique again over that die cutting around the edges. I'm inking on that, and then I'm going to do some stamping on this background. So I'm just going to put this into my stamp positioning tool and grab this great background stamp. This is 40-781 music background. So you can see this kind of consists of painting the papers, doing the background die cutting, doing the focal point die cutting, and then just having a few stamps like this music note background, that nature's garlands to do those light branches that just add that subtle stamping in the background. So here I'm using that jumbo bobble die. I've stamped my sentiment on top and white heat embossed it, and then I'm just again grabbing from all of these sprigs and gluing them along the top. And I definitely think this is a card I might not normally create if I wasn't creating in this sort of assembly line style. When I had all these all ready to go and die cut, it was so easy to grab them and layer them, try different ways with them, that if I had just set out to make each of these cards one by one by one, it would have been really time consuming to paint the paper, die cut the paper, assemble this one card, then start on the next card. And it's just fun to rearrange them and slide them in here and there and have them all ready to go at your fingertips. So I'm just going for these kind of cascading down from the top. And then I love this ribbon die. So that ribbon piece is actually a die that comes with the jumbo bobble. There's two different ribbon styles, and oh, I just think it's so pretty. I think I'll be using that on a lot of different cards any season, because it's just, it looks very natural, sort of the flow of that ribbon on there. And so I just added that to that background, and the card is complete. I love the bright pop of red on this card in particular, and that zigzag stacker die in the background. So we're going to make another card with that bobble. I went ahead this time off camera and stamped that music background right onto the bobble itself. I'm going to add a little bit of inking around the edges just to darken that up and sort of make that edge look more finished. I did some broken china, and then also some, I believe it's Toffee Crunch Memento ink with that. Again, all the colors are listed down below in the description box. And then here is that Holidays die again. This is one of the blue ones, and I love that sort of imperfect look. You've got those speckled lines on there, but I wanted to make it just a little bit more green. So just right on top of that, I'm putting a little bit of green ink on top of the die, and look at the beautiful variation that you get in that. So don't be afraid to cut some of your greenery from blues and then ink it up with green and have just a peak of that blue like at the tips of the holly leaf, and it gives it some great dimension. I assembled everything together there, layered it up with a ribbon, one of those antique background pieces, and I also did our textural die along the top of that antique frames die and stamped my sentiment down at the bottom. Now here is a third idea with the Jumbo Bobble die. This die is great because it is a nice size. So the cards you've seen with it are a standard 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card. So it is a nice large bauble. And what I love about that is you can also stamp right on it, so make it look like an ornament with a design. So here I have stamped that hollyberry bird stamp on there. I didn't stamp the birds, you certainly could. I painted it in using Distress Ink Reinkers used as watercolors. You could use whatever type of medium you like for painting in line art stamps. I added a little ink around the edge, and then I have this bauble that looks like it has a Christmas design on it. I decided here to darken up that ribbon just a little bit. And then I will add all these pieces together. And again, I just grabbed from backgrounds I had done, added a little music note stamping just up at the top, and added those sort of branches coming in from the right, ones I already had painted inside the envelopes. So next up I'm going to do some more cards with that Holidays die, and I'm going to mix them with some sort of vintage background stamping, some more of that tone-on-tone background look. I'm using the vintage postcard and the letter background onto the zigzag stacker die cut piece. I'm using a very light ink for this antique linen, but stamping it a few times until it's just the right. I just wanted it barely there. And then I'm grabbing that Holidays die because I'm going to just checking the positioning for that. Now I also wanted to use this letter background, so I'm just inking that up with Toffee Crunch ink and stamping it onto white cardstock. And then I will use that same Toffee Crunch ink to do some ink blending right on top. Just very light ink blending. And you can see there I've sort of torn the edge of my paper, and that's where you can see that letter background popping out. In just a minute I'll show you the postcard card too, the one that I use that vintage postcard stamping on. So for this one I just added, this is one of the 5x7 cards. It's a little bit shorter than 7 inches. I trimmed it down so it would be an even border around all the sides, but this is the Holidays die, and then adding the berries that come with that die. The ribbon from the ornament is up there on top, and then that letter background stamping along that torn edge, sort of peeking out behind there. So here is that card. Again, look at that pretty variation on the background, on that holly. Very easy to put together with all those pieces done and ready to go. And then here's the one with the vintage postcard, and it's got more of that letter background going on there and the sentiment stamped. And that one is also a larger card, approximately 5x7. Now here is one more. I used a lot of my leftover pieces and just glued them onto a background to fill it up, and it actually ended up being one of my favorite cards. I just wanted to give you a look at that one all done there. So gather up your pieces and just glue them onto a background, and even that is quite beautiful. And I stamped my sentiment from 30-924 Shine God's Glory. Did that and white heat embossed it onto black cardstock and tuck that in under one of those holly leaves. Boy, I sure hope you made it to the end. If you did, thank you so much. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, as well as Instagram, our website, and blog, and I've got all those linked down for you in the YouTube description box as well. Happy stamping!